Hello! Today we're going to be talking about the characteristics of life. We're going to start off this section by learning about a term called spontaneous generation. Now, spontaneous generation was an idea that was believed in the times of Aristotle. What they saw were flies were emerging from decaying meat. So, spontaneous generation is the idea that all living things can arise from non-living material. They even thought that frogs came about because of the falling raindrops. Okay, they had a little bit of a clue that mammals were born and that birds came from eggs after they've been hatched, but the smaller creatures were very confusing to them. They really felt spontaneous generation occurred. Now, this idea was believed up until the 1660s. And what happened was Francisco Redi observed maggots growing into flies. So he started to question the idea. And he didn't know that if you dissected a deer and it contained a fetus in it, that would also discount spontaneous generation. So he did an experiment. He had a dead snake, dead fish, some dead eels, veal, and he put them in 4 different containers. And he sealed the tops with wax. He then took the same materials, the dead snake, the fish, the eels, and the veal, and put them in another container, but left that open to air. And he watched them. And a couple days later, he found the dead organisms, dead meat, and so forth, had maggots on it. And then flies were starting to emerge out. The sealed containers or the vessels did not have any maggots or flies. Okay, so there was still a question. Well, they had no air. That's why they couldn't get it. So he set up another experiment. He had 2 vessels or containers, and he left them both open to air. However, on the one set, he did put a very fine gauze over it so air could get in, but the flies could not get in. And he proved that yes, there is no maggots that are growing out of the one that has the gauze on it. But people still didn't agree with him. So there were some more people who did some more experiments, and they were doing experiments with microorganisms. And there was a guy from Italy who performed an experiment with broth with bacteria, and he said, no, this does still not support spontaneous generation. So it wasn't until 1861, 200 years later, that Louis Pasteur came up with an experiment that convinced people that spontaneous generation does not produce those microorganisms. So what he did is he set up a special flask, and he put some broth in it, which he had boiled, and he had sterilized the flask. Now the flask was special because it had a curved neck. He actually melted the glass so it had an S-shaped neck. Air was allowed to enter, but any microorganisms or particulate matter that was in the air settled into a trap on the S curve. And he watched it for a year, and there were no more microorganisms. He even went so far to actually tilt the flask so it could get to that trapped area in that S curve, and it did then provide bacteria growth once it contacted that. Okay, so this was finally the thing that said spontaneous generation did not occur. So you could see the flask with the S-shaped neck, and the particulates would settle in at the curve of that neck. And he watched for a year. There were no microorganisms, and then he tilted it so the broth did contact with that little area that had the microorganisms in it, and that was to say that, yeah, bacteria did grow then. Okay. So back in 1870, a term came up called biogenesis, and that was from Thomas Huxley. Biogenesis is the definition is all living things arise only from other living things of the same type. Pretty much what we believe in today. Okay, so now we're going to focus in on characteristics of life. Many books have many different characteristics of life. This is a list I've compiled that I feel is pretty thorough, and we'll go through each one of them. I want to point out that in order to be considered alive, you do need to have all of these characteristics of life. Okay, so let's start off. Number 1 is movement. All right, we walk, we run, we could swim, snakes can slither, fly, whatever have you. Plants even move towards the sun. We also have the ability to respond to stimuli. If I was to throw a ball at you, you would hopefully react and catch the ball. If you were an animal outside and there was a predator coming after you, hopefully you would respond and try to get away. We do require energy from the environment, and we get that energy from the foods that we eat. And if you remember from the organic compounds, we do get it from the carbs and the lipids that we consume in our body. I'm just going to talk briefly about energy. Energy is going to be considered ATP and ADP. What it stands for is adenosine triphosphate for ADP and adenosine diphosphate for ADP. So the key here is that we have 3 phosphates and 2 phosphates for the ADP. Now, ATP is called the energy carrier. Okay, just to show you its structure, we have an adenine base, we have a ribose, which is called the adenosine, and we have 3 phosphates. Now, what happens is when the bond between the second and the third phosphate breaks, that is going to release free energy that our body can then use. So if you look at this diagram, we have ATP. When we turn into ADP, that releases energy. If we want to recreate ATP, we then need to add in energy. Okay, so back to the characteristics of life. The fourth one is excreting energy. So we're going to be doing chemicals, waste, products. As we go through our metabolism, our life processes, things are going to be excreted. We also are composed of cells, and we will talk about cells in our next unit, but I do want to point out the cell theory. And again, this will come up again in the cell unit. So the cell theory is, cell is the basic living unit of all organisms. All organisms are composed of cells and their cell products, and all cells come from other cells. And we will learn in depth all the parts of the cell and all of the functions that it can do. Okay, back to our list. So we also go through metabolism and we maintain homeosynthesis. Homeosynthesis is that our body is in check. There's nothing chaotic going on, we're not sick, and so forth. So there's a lot of chemical reactions like synthesis or decomposition that help with our metabolism. Okay, there's growth and development. So we start off as a baby and we grow into an adult, or a plant starts off as a seedling, and then it grows into a tree. We require water. We produce organic compounds. So plants would produce carbs and lipids. We produce lipids and proteins and so forth. And we do reproduce and we inherit certain traits. Now, this is the only trait that you as an individual do not need to do in order to be alive. You as an individual do not have to have children, but you are still able to be alive. However, if the entire population did not have the ability to reproduce, well, we would not be alive after that. And the last one is adaptation. We need to adapt to our environment. And then when we talk about evolution, this is a big thing, is adaptation. The easiest thing to see is in the winter, dogs grow a thicker coat. And in the summertime, they lose their coat and they shed like crazy. So that would be one example of that. So if you have any questions at all, please see me tomorrow and ask them. Thanks.